Welcome to today's deep dive. It's really great to have you here with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really looking forward to getting into this one.
Me too. We have a pretty compelling mission for you today, centered around unpacking a fascinating excerpt from a text called Dissolving the Invisible Cage.
Right, which is quite the title.
It really is. And our goal as we work through these sources is to explore this shared psychological condition that almost never gets discussed out loud.
No, it really doesn't. But it dictates the trajectory of practically everyone's life.
Exactly. We are looking at why humans so frequently feel profoundly stuck or paralyzed or just confined, even when they possess total absolute autonomy to make their own choices.
It is the ultimate modern paradox, honestly. We are
Yeah.
looking at source material that directly challenges our foundational assumptions about the very nature of autonomy.
Yeah, because we operate under this collective illusion, right?
We
Yeah.
assume that because we have dismantled so many of the historical, physical barriers to self-determination, we are inherently free.
Like the laws have changed, so the mind must be free.
Exactly. But the text we are analyzing argues that this assumption fundamentally misunderstands how human confinement actually functions in the modern era.
And that distinction, the difference between physical and psychological confinement, is where the source material immediately grabs your attention.
It's the core of the whole argument.
Right. Because we tend to define freedom through the lens of physics.
Yes.
If there is no literal lock on the door, if no one is stationed in the hallway physically obstructing your path, the logical conclusion is that you are free to leave.
It's a binary way of looking at it. Open door equals freedom.
But I want you, the listener, to really consider the reality of your own experience right now. Think about that persistent, heavy sensation of being trapped.
Trapped in a specific daily routine, maybe.
Yes, a routine or a career track or just a general lifestyle. Technically, the physical barrier to exit is absolute zero.
Zero. You could literally stand up right now.
Exactly. You could abandon your current profession, walk out the door, and buy a one-way ticket to another continent today without breaking a single law.
But you don't.
You don't. And the text asks us to confront the uncomfortable reality of why you don't do that, and why the mere thought of doing it feels not just impractical, but physically impossible.
To understand the mechanics of that paralysis, we have to move past the physical environment entirely. It's completely irrelevant.
The physical environment is irrelevant.
Yeah, because if the door is wide open, but the occupant refuses to cross the threshold, the barrier is no longer architectural. It is neurological.
Wow, yeah, that makes perfect sense.
The source material suggests that to comprehend this phenomenon, we must examine what it categorizes as invisible structures.
Invisible structures.
Right. These are deeply ingrained, unwritten frameworks that govern human behavior. And they do so with a level of efficiency that a literal physical prison system could never even hope to achieve.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because when the text details the architecture of these invisible structures, it gets highly specific regarding the rules we absorb throughout our development.
It does. It breaks them down into categories.
It categorizes them into a few major pillars of modern existence. First, it points to rigid work schedules.
The standard grind.
Right, but it isn't just about having a job. It's the internalized belief that human value and productivity must be extracted in a strictly linear fashion.
Typically 40 hours a week.
40 hours a week during specific daylight hours for the entirety of one's capable adult life.
Yeah.
That is a massive invisible structure.
It is massive. And then it pairs that with heavy financial expectations,
Yes, the financial pillar.
which is this silent, pervasive agreement that success is inextricably linked to escalating material milestones.
The underlying assumption that your square footage and your vehicle must continuously upgrade as a proxy for your personal evolution.
Exactly. If we connect this to the bigger picture, those pillars are supported by a relentless need for social approval and incredibly narrow definitions of success.
Narrow definitions that we just accept as default.
Yes. And the text offers a brilliant analysis of how this functions primarily as an exercise in lifelong socialization.
Which starts early.
Very early. The genius of these invisible structures is that they do not require constant, overt, external enforcement forever. In early childhood, the enforcement is external. Parents, teachers, institutions, they explicitly reward compliance and punish deviation.
Right, gold stars and detentions.
Exactly. However, as the individual matures, a sophisticated internal transition occurs. The external pressures are seamlessly transformed into internal programming.
The societal rubric becomes the personal operating system.
Perfectly. You essentially become your own warden.
You become your own warden. And relating this directly to you listening, it is really worth examining how this internalized programming dictates your daily reality.
It's in everything we do.
Consider the friction involved in simply contemplating a radical life change. Just thinking about it. You might be deeply unfulfilled in your current industry, right?
Right.
And you might even have the financial means to survive a transition and the legal right to submit a resignation letter tomorrow morning.
The door is wide open.
The door is wide open, yet as you sit at your desk and play out that scenario in your mind, the psychological resistance is overwhelming.
It feels like a wall.
A huge wall. The source material highlights that while a human might possess the technical capacity to redesign their life from the ground up, the internal operating system flags that action as a critical error.
A system failure.
Yes, the psychological barrier manifests as a visceral, almost biological impossibility.
Which brings us to the underlying mechanism driving that visceral reaction.
The why?
Exactly, the why. Why does the prospect of redesigning a life trigger such an intense psychological block when the physical constraints are non-existent?
Right, why do we freeze?
What the source material reveals is a profound insight into the human condition, specifically concerning how our identity becomes inextricably fused with stability.
Fused with stability, meaning our concept of self is constructed around these predictable frameworks.
Yes. The identity isn't a standalone entity. It's heavily reliant on the context.
Right, so I am defined by the title I hold,
Yeah.
the geographic location I inhabit, and the specific set of societal expectations I successfully meet every day.
Okay, what's fascinating here is how the source frames this as an evolutionary mismatch.
An evolutionary mismatch. How so?
Well, the text states that, on a fundamental level, humans fear the loss of security significantly more than they desire the acquisition of freedom.
Wow.
While contemporary culture heavily romanticizes the concept of freedom in art and literature and movies, our biological wiring tells a very different story.
Because of how we evolved.
Exactly. For early hominids, predictability equated to survival. Stepping away from the established patterns of the tribe to forge a completely independent path usually resulted in starvation or predation.
You wander off, you die.
You wander off, you die. Consequently, the modern human brain interprets a sudden divergence from routine, like a radical career shift or a rejection of societal norms, with the exact same physiological panic as wandering unprotected into a hostile wilderness.
So chaos is perceived as a terminal threat.
Absolutely. The brain cannot tell the difference between quitting a corporate job and walking into a tiger's den.
So what does this all mean for us today? It indicates that we are the active architects of our own confinement.
We are building it ourselves.
The invisible cage the text describes is not some external oppressive force pushed upon us by an abstract society.
No, it's highly localized.
It is a highly localized enclosure constructed entirely from deeply held, unquestioned beliefs. We absorb the societal blueprints, we lay the foundation through our habits, and we reinforce the bars by tying our entire sense of identity to the stability of the structure.
We prioritize the safety of the known, however miserable it might be, over the terrifying ambiguity of the unknown.
The misery is at least predictable.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The maintenance of that cage requires constant cognitive energy,
Yeah.
but it functions as a highly effective anxiety reduction mechanism.
As long as the individual prioritizes the security of an inherited routine over the autonomy of conscious choice, the invisible cage remains impenetrable.
The boundaries feel absolute. They provide a suffocating but very reliable sense of order in an otherwise chaotic world.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though.
Okay.
The source material pivots from diagnosing the structure of the cage to exploring the precise mechanism of its dissolution.
Now break it down.
Yes. It focuses on a very specific turning point in the human experience. It investigates the moment an individual begins to experience a critical dissonance regarding these deeply ingrained beliefs.
It's a friction.
The friction. Eventually, the psychological friction of living a highly prescribed life begins to outweigh the comfort of its predictability.
And the psychological phenomenon that follows this initial friction is incredibly nuanced. The text emphasizes that during this phase, the physical environment remains entirely static.
Nothing outside changes.
Nothing. The individual wakes up in the same house, navigates the same commute, and interacts with the same colleagues. The external variables are completely untouched.
So what changes?
What undergoes a seismic shift is the individual's perception of those variables. The automatic filter of necessity begins to fail.
The source refers to this specific perceptual shift as noticing the glitch in the system.
The glitch. It's a
It's
great
right.
term. It is a powerful conceptual framework. It resembles the moment a viewer suddenly registers the brushstrokes on a canvas instead of just seeing the painting,
Right.
or notices the pixels in a digital simulation. It is the sudden, jarring awareness of the constructed nature of reality.
And it rarely happens dramatically.
Right, it doesn't usually happen during a dramatic life crisis. It happens on a random Tuesday while you are staring at a spreadsheet,
Or sitting in a redundant meeting.
or engaging in a transaction you have completed 1,000 times before. In
Yeah.
that perfectly mundane moment, the internalized programming stutters.
It skips a beat. And an unprompted realization cuts through all the noise. The rules governing this interaction are completely fabricated.
That moment of clarity is highly disruptive
Yeah.
because it strips away the illusion of inevitability.
The illusion that things have to be this way.
Yes. Once an individual perceives the glitch, once they recognize that the frameworks dictating their behavior are merely inherited social agreements rather than laws of physics, the perception cannot be
I
reversed.
can't unsee it.
You cannot see it. The source explains that this initial tear in the fabric of the invisible cage inevitably leads the individual to interrogate their reality on a much deeper structural level.
The text outlines two specific foundational questions that emerge in the wake of noticing the glitch.
And these are big questions.
Huge. These are not tactical questions about how to optimize a morning routine or secure a minor promotion. They are existential inquiries aimed directly at the load-bearing walls of the invisible cage.
What's the first one?
The first question the source identifies is this life designed for me, or did I inherit it?
Is this life designed for me, or did I inherit it? That raises an incredibly important question regarding the nature of autonomy and the passive reception of our life scripts.
Because acknowledging that a life is inherited rather than consciously chosen introduces a radical cognitive dissonance.
It does. When we inherit a worldview, a definition of success, or a specific trajectory regarding our career and finances, we process it as a default setting.
We just accept it.
We accept the parameters set by our culture and our immediate environment without ever subjecting them to critical analysis.
But the moment you formally question the origin of your life's design, you create psychological distance between yourself and the programming.
You step back.
You transition from being the software to being the observer of the software. You recognize that the path you are walking was paved by historical momentum, not personal intent.
It is the stark realization that you have been flawlessly executing someone else's blueprint.
Which is an uncomfortable realization for anyone.
Very uncomfortable. But recognizing that lack of authorship naturally forces the progression to the second structural question highlighted in the text.
Right. Once the inheritance is acknowledged, the necessary follow-up becomes, what would my life look like if I chose it consciously?
What would my life look like if I chose it consciously? That specific inquiry represents the ultimate threat to the integrity of the invisible cage.
It dissolves it.
It does.
Uh-huh.
Conscious choice acts as a solvent to internalized programming. By asking what a deliberately chosen life looks like, the individual ceases to operate on autopilot.
They wake up.
They stop utilizing the fear of instability as their primary navigational tool. The text posits that the cognitive action of wrestling with these two questions, identifying the inherited nature of the present and hypothesizing the conscious design of the future, is the precise mechanism that triggers the dissolution of the confinement.
Because a cage isn't made of steel, it's made of unquestioned assumptions.
Exactly. The structural integrity relies entirely on the individual never looking directly at the bars.
The moment deliberate, conscious scrutiny is applied, the belief system can no longer bear the weight of the reality it is trying to enforce.
It collapses. The limitations are exposed as shadows cast by the individual's own anxieties, rather than external immovable objects.
Now, the text is very careful to manage expectations regarding the aftermath of this realization.
This is a crucial point.
Because socially, we are heavily conditioned to associate liberation with massive cinematic upheaval.
The movie version of freedom.
Right. The cultural narrative suggests that finding freedom requires drafting a manifesto, severing all ties, flipping a desk, and relocating to an off-grid compound in the woods.
That's not what the text says.
No. The source material pushes back against that narrative hard, pointing out that the actual arrival of true psychological freedom is rarely a grand, explosive spectacle.
It is characterized more as a quiet internal recalibration.
The quiet realization.
Yes. The text defines the antidote to the invisible cage, not as an external revolution, but as an internal shift in the individual's relationship to their circumstances.
So you don't have to quit your job to be free.
No, it is entirely possible to undergo this dissolution and decide to remain in the exact same job, the same city, and the same relationships.
So what is the difference then?
The distinction lies entirely in the locus of control. The individual remains in those circumstances out of conscious selection rather than a fearful adherence to the default setting.
They are there because they chose to be, not because they are afraid to leave.
Exactly.
The fundamental takeaway from the source material is the revelation regarding the extreme flexibility of life's structure.
Flexibility is the key word.
We are systematically conditioned to view life as highly fragile and rigidly defined, carrying this constant threat that deviating from the prescribed sequence of events will result in catastrophic failure.
The text completely dismantles that fragility.
It does. It demonstrates that the timeline, the definitions of achievement, and the daily frameworks are infinitely malleable. The guardrails we assume are solid concrete are largely imaginary.
That recognition of flexibility represents a profound paradigm shift. It moves the individual from a defensive posture of avoiding instability to an offensive posture of conscious design.
The realization that boundaries can be renegotiated and that personal definitions of value can supersede societal metrics neutralizes the power of the internalized programming. I really encourage you to apply this analytical framework directly to your own landscape today. Look at the persistent routines, the recurring frustrations, and the perceived limitations you navigate daily.
Look at the things you feel you have to do.
Examine the rationalizations you use when you tell yourself why a different outcome is impossible. Test those limitations against the concept of ultimate flexibility.
Push on the walls a bit.
Exactly. Whether it pertains to your professional trajectory, your living environment, or your metric for a successful existence, the source material argues that the parameters are entirely subject to your conscious revision. Once you genuinely internalize that the structure can bend, the invisible cage simply ceases to exist.
It just vanishes.
So, to synthesize the ground we have covered in this deep dive, we initiated our analysis by examining the critical error of conflating physical autonomy with psychological freedom.
The open door paradox.
Right. We moved through the text breakdown of how societal structures are internalized to form an invisible cage, maintained by our evolutionary bias towards security and predictability.
The fear of the unknown.
We explored the disruptive nature of the glitch, that sudden perceptual shift that exposes the constructed nature of our routines. And we analyzed how deploying two specific questions regarding inheritance versus conscious design acts as the mechanism to dissolve those self-imposed boundaries,
Ultimately revealing the inherent flexibility of how a life can be structured.
The source material provides a rigorous roadmap from passive confinement to active authorship.
It really does. And as we conclude our analysis of these concepts, there is a final, deeper implication to consider that extends from the text's premise.
Okay, what is that?
We established earlier that the human identity becomes structurally fused with the stability provided by the invisible cage.
Right, we are defined by our routines.
Exactly. Who we perceive ourselves to be is heavily reliant on the rules we consistently follow. Therefore, a critical variable remains. What happens to the self in the immediate aftermath of the cage's dissolution?
Oh, wow.
If your core identity was forged by adhering to those inherited, rigid frameworks, does the acquisition of true freedom inherently require the destruction of the old identity?
Because the structure holding it up is gone.
Yes. To operate as a truly free, consciously designing individual, we must ask if we are prepared to endure the psychological cost of letting the former version of ourselves become obsolete, and undertaking the immense task of constructing a new identity from the ground up without the comfort of a blueprint.
The true cost of psychological freedom being the willing sacrifice of your established identity. That is an incredibly potent concept to reflect on.
It changes everything about how you view the work of becoming free.
It really does. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the mechanics of our invisible structures. It has been a privilege to navigate this source material with you. Keep examining the origins of your daily routines and continue to challenge the boundaries of your own perceived limitations. We will catch you next time.
Until next time, keep analyzing the framework.